everyone. I'm really, really honored today to be doing this video collaboration with Mr. Salles, who, as you would probably all know, is the host of Mr. Salles Teaches English, and has this amazing, fantastic channel with lots of English literature and English language resources. So basically, this video is just going to be a quick 10 tips on how to revise for an English literature exam. Okay, so obviously if you're doing your GCSEs or your A-levels, this is going to be relevant to you guys, but equally this should be applicable to any other English literature exam that, you know, any high school student or even beyond would be doing. So yeah, Mr. Salles, are you ready to do this?
I'm very excited. Let's do it.
Okay, great.
One on my list was finding different interpretations. So whatever exam board students do, they get most credit from looking at different ways we can interpret characters or themes. That's basically it. And if you've got competing or opposite interpretations, it's much easier for you to write well because you're constantly aware of what you're trying to prove or disprove. And it's really easy to include both views in parts of your answer. And whenever you do that, a light bulb goes off in the examiner's heads and they think, right, this is a conceptualized response. This is a student who really knows their stuff. So I'm definitely wanting to give this a good mark. And the other reason having alternative interpretations works is whenever you meet a new quotation or a new idea, you're linking it back to these competing interpretations. So I think you actually remember the text much better and you get much more personally involved in it. It makes literature come alive. There's a point to it rather than just being great at maths. So that was my top #1 tip.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Salles in terms of coming up with competing interpretations. I think that is always the best way to show depth in your answer. I personally think a lot of students just kind of latch onto one interpretation that they personally find genuinely very good, but then what they do is then they'll just kind of parrot it and they'll say, yeah, you know, according to this interpretation, this is, you know, this, it should be seen as this way. And then they just kind of get dyed in the wool about it and they don't really kind of see from another perspective, which really compromises the depth of their answer. So yeah, do remember tip 1 from Mr. Salles. And so my second tip, well, sorry, my first tip, but this is tip 2 in your video, is start with why. So I think a lot of students tend to just kind of get flustered when they first start just thinking, okay, how do I come up with analysis? How do I come up with interpretation in the first place, right? So I think a lot of students tend to get sidetracked by the how. So they definitely think about, oh, how does the author show this or that about a certain theme or character? And the how is often a question about technique, I feel. But actually, the how is just a means to asking a bigger and more important question, which is the why, right? So it's always important that we think about why does the author choose to use a specific technique, right? Especially in poetry, for example. Why does the author have the character do or say something at a specific point in the text? Or why does the scene or the chapter begin and end like that, right? So whenever you think about questions like that, you'll be able to actually come up with those techniques, right? For example, if you think about, oh, why does the chapter end like this? Well, you can then think, oh, it's a cliffhanger, right? So these terms should then come as a result of you engaging with the why question, okay? So bottom line is never, ever simply identify a key technique or just regurgitate a bunch of quotes and think that's, you know, kind of job done. It's really important to link the techniques or the quotes to the author's purpose or the wider message or theme conveyed, I think. Yeah, that's my second tip.
Yeah, I love that. So when you're getting students to understand the why, how much do you use like the social and historical context and how much the context of the author's life?
I think context should always just inform, but it should never really usurp, you know, like the main analysis. So I think the why in terms of context would always come at the start in the intro. But when we're thinking about the why in terms of why a certain technique is used, that wouldn't necessarily link so much to the context, I think. So there's macro why and there's the micro why. Yeah, the macro why would be more the context. Why did Shakespeare, like, you know, like, you know, feature witches, for example. Oh, okay, because of, you know, Jane, blah, 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 you know, he was interested in what have you. That's a macro why, right? You wouldn't really feature that in every single main body paragraph, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, there are some questions where context isn't in the mark scheme, and I get students writing to me saying, you know, well, why are you teaching me context when it's not marked? And for me, context is so important because it's the only really real way you can understand why the author is constructing the text in a particular way.
Right.
You know, or why are they presenting this character in this way? It always comes back to some sort of contextual reasons. So for me, having an understanding of the context makes it much easier to understand as what you call the macro why, the big why. In the last few months, I've tried to think of like, how would I join all of literature together for a student? And I've come up with basically 5 whys. So there's only really, I mean, it's very reductive, but I've just thought there's only really 5 whys that any author is writing about. It's either morality linked to religion, or gender power relationships in society, the impact of science and technology, or the impact of education, and then people's different social statuses. And so I reckon if I studied any text, I would be able to write about it just thinking about those 5 whys. And that would also transfer, this is why I created this kind of simplification, it would also transfer to any text I have to analyze in the language exam as well. So if I kind of understood those 5 contexts well, I'd be able to apply it to any poetry, any Shakespeare, any 19th century novel, and any extract that I meet in the language exam. So this is something that I've come to late in my teaching, thinking, you know, can I find some unifying principles that will make studying language and literature really easy, because they all come back to similar ideas. So that's where my thinking is at the minute. I don't know.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think ultimately this boils down to the sort of different approaches to looking at literature in terms of, you know, using a historicist approach or a textualist approach, right? I know these are like annoying terms, but bear with me. Some of you may have heard of the term practical criticism. So it's basically just looking at a text in terms of what the text shows us, right? And not to really think about the external historical, cultural, intellectual, social, political influences. Yeah, that's, you know, I think it's a contentious approach. I think not a lot of people like that, but there are equally other people who, especially when it comes to poetry, I think this is particularly pertinent, where like some people just think, why do you have to care about the author's life? You know, you can literally just look at the words in the poem and then you'll be able to come up with a hypothetical why, which is like the like, why does the poet use metaphor, right? In this moment, maybe it's trying to convey some sort of emotional intensity, what have you. Obviously, when it comes to something like illusion, that would be difficult to not engage with the wider, because like that's the nature of collusion. Sorry, not collusion, illusion, right? If you're looking at a novel, especially like a 19th century novel, it's really hard to not adopt some sort of historicist approach, right? If it's a romantic poem, for example, maybe it's fine to not care. So extent.
So, I mean, when I did my degree, everything was text-based. You know, God is dead, the author's dead, and that's like no context, just go in at the text. As I've got older, I found, I mean, I loved that at the time, but as I've got older, I found that slightly limiting.
Sure, it's definitely limiting, but it also means less work.
Yeah, exactly.
Who doesn't love less work? So what about your 3rd tip?
Write essays. Okay, here we go. Right. So when I first started teaching, I did what most teachers do. I taught the text really well, or I hoped it was really well. And then I focused on key quotations, usually too many. And then when students had really brilliant knowledge of the text, I then said, write an essay. I might help you plan it, but you know, go away and write an essay. And I've realized that is like the most inefficient way to learn a text, because it takes forever and the kids never actually learn, how do I write a top grade essay? Whereas I'm now thinking, right, if I had my time again, I'd go in with a text like Macbeth or Christmas Carol, and I'd say, right, these are the 10 essays we're going to study. And these 10 essays would cover every character and every theme, and they'd cover all sorts of alternative interpretations. And I think that's important, because then you'd put 2 alternative interpretations in front of students and they wouldn't just be able to nick one. They'd have to argue, you know, well, I agree with that, but I don't agree with that, but I do agree with this. And they'd synthesize and make their own meaning. Now, as a student, you can do that for yourself. You can say, right, I can go on the exam board website and I know what the top 7 questions are going to be that come up every year. So in Macbeth, you know, any question about the supernatural is also really a question about Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. So if I revise those 3, can I find any questions that aren't about Lady Macbeth, Macbeth, or the supernatural? Oh yeah, I can find a couple more. And you end up with about 7 questions. And then you just write your essays to those 7 questions as your revision. While you're doing that, you will find not just similar quotations that you're using across each, but you will also find lots of similar evidence you're using about what you think the author's purpose is. And you'll find also similar bits of structural detail that you think is significant. You know, like Lady Macbeth dies off stage. Why? Macbeth never approaches her body. And you'll come up with a theory about why this happens that will be relevant suddenly to your supernatural essay, your essay about power, your essay about Macbeth, your essay about violence. And by writing the essays, you'll kind of find out what's really important. And my theory is that when you go into the exam, you kind of already got the answer in your head, even if the question is something you've never written. Every part of that answer you've already thought through in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of your other essays. And if you think an essay under time conditions might take you 45 minutes, well, you could spend 2 hours writing it with your books in front of you. And so that would be, you know, 10 essays, 20 hours of revision, guaranteed top grade, and you're done. So that will be my other top tip. Write the essays and you'll stroll the exam.
Yeah, I actually really agree with that, because that was my next tip, to be honest. It probably would be helpful, obviously, to actually write the essay, prepare for the actual essay and write it up. But I think it's equally helpful to just draft up essay plans. So you can revise by drafting up essay plans, right? Because my point is, I think students just need to stop passively absorbing material.
Yeah.
Just kind of like sit there and be like, I've done my revision for like 5 hours, I've memorized quotes, why am I still not doing well? Well, because that's not the way to revise effectively. I think it's most effective when you're actively engaging with your material. So I think what you could do, guys, is when you're drafting up an essay plan, you can kind of go through your list of key themes, or imagine each theme or topic as an exam essay question. So one way that I think would be effective is if you look at past paper questions and then just kind of use that, like use the way they word it, use the way they phrase it, and just kind of slot in like different themes and like write an essay based on those command words and those questions, right? And so obviously this, you know, when it comes to an essay plan, really clear tables with columns and rows, bullet points, clear sections, what quotes to use, etc. And so even better if you guys can do this within a timed limit when you're revising. I know this is added pressure, but I really think it's effective when you just say, okay, I'm just going to set myself like 10 to 15 minutes just writing up the essay plan, being really disciplined. And I think if you do that enough, it's not necessarily that you will actually be able to prep for the actual essay when, you know, it comes time for the exam. It's just that you will have honed your essay planning skills for the actual exam. So it's those skills that you would improve, and that's super crucial to doing well.
I love that approach. So I was really interested to see what you'd say about planning, because the idea of a plan, when teachers teach planning anyway, I find they teach something that students kind of really don't learn from. Whereas I can't picture it, but you've talked about columns. You've obviously got a really structured and organized way of making a plan. So what would that look like?
Well, the idea is actually to just kind of create a table with, say, maybe 3 columns. And then you'd have like your intro, main body section, and the conclusion. And then it'll be bullet points saying like what you need to include in each section, right? So in the intro, obviously you need some context and you need the thesis statement, right? Like these are non-negotiables. You just have to include them. And then for a main body section, for a main body paragraph, you just need like the topic sentence. Like you need your evidence, your quotes, and then that leads on to the analysis. I realize that, you know, for some students, when you get to the A levels, this might be a slightly more stilted approach. But I think, it's the awareness of it. Like, it's just because these things you have to include in an essay anyway, right? And so maybe say if you get to a high level, then you can kind of write, okay, what about framing this in a different interpretative framework, right? And then just writing down that framework in the table. As it's just basically being able to visualize what you're going to write, as opposed to just being like, okay, you know, I'm going to put pen to paper and just start writing.
Yeah.
All in my head. No, it's not. Yeah. Like it is just in a jumble. So I think it's about just being able to visualize that flow, even if it's just a rough sketch. That's kind of the rationale. You don't have to necessarily follow it like, you know, to the T.